All right, to wrap up Unit 1 Physiology here, we're going to talk about a few additional endocrine hormones. And most of these I'm just going to kind of hit some highlights on because we're going to hear about them later in the semester when we talk about particular body systems. All right, so if you have done the anatomy side, hopefully you have by now, I did mention, and you have to be able to identify the pineal gland, which actually you should have had been required to identify that when you studied the brain back in Biology 201. So that should not be anything new. That's over on the posterior side of the diencephalon part of the brain, back side of the third ventricle, and it's a little tiny gland, and there are cells in there. They're actually called pinealocytes. I've never actually tried to pronounce that word before, but cells in the pineal gland, and they produce melatonin. And melatonin is a molecule that's actually related to serotonin, an important neurotransmitter that you probably learned a little bit about in Biology 201. But melatonin has very different effects. The main function that we associate with melatonin and the pineal gland, day-night cycles, your biorhythms. So things like light changes trigger secretion of melatonin to prepare you for sleeping. And so those are some of the things that this hormone is involved in. Involved in other biological rhythms, things like your body temperature, your sleep cycles, your appetite that kind of fluctuate throughout the day to help you out with normal functioning. May also be involved in the timing of puberty. So we mentioned that a little bit earlier as well with those androgens from the adrenal cortex. Still not completely clear what winds up triggering puberty and those changes that occur when we reach that age, which was a long time ago for many of us. Okay. All right, sex hormones. So we've already mentioned the adrenal cortex, the gonadotropins, those male sex hormones that are produced in smaller amounts by those glands. And the gonads, the testes in the male, ovaries in the female, they're the organs that are responsible for producing by far most of our sex hormones. So the ovaries produce estrogens and progesterone. Progesterone is a hormone that's very important for pregnancy and some of the changes that occur with that. Estrogens are the main female sex hormones, so they are estrogens are involved in female sex characteristics, maturation of the reproductive organs in a female. And we'll learn a lot more about estrogens when we cover the reproductive system at the end of the semester. The placenta in a pregnant female also produces, it winds up having some endocrine functions as well. It produces estrogens and progesterone. Progesterone is a pregnancy hormone that's very important. And human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, is another one we'll hear about toward the end of the course. That's the hormone that is produced very early in a pregnancy, and it's the one when you take a home pregnancy test, that's what the home pregnancy test is actually detecting. That should only be produced by a female who is early in her pregnancy. All right, and then in a male, the testes produce testosterone, and testosterone is the main male sex hormone. It's responsible for all of a male's reproductive organs maturing and developing properly, and then your usual characteristics, secondary sexual characteristics, are those things that you associate with maleness: body hair, increased muscle mass, increased bone mass, deeper voice, things like that, going bald, those kinds of things. It's important for sperm production. Those, and for right now, we're just hitting some of the highlights here. We're going to hear a lot more about estrogen and HCG and all of these different hormones when we get toward the end of the course. Just want to introduce those to you now. Believe it or not, your fat cells, adipose tissue, are have some endocrine functions as well. They produce at least 3 hormones, and one of those is leptin. Leptin is important for controlling appetite. Every once in a while you may see leptin in the news as well. People are really interested in whether or not we can manipulate leptin to decrease our appetite, which is, as we all know, many of us, our appetites tend to be overactive a lot of the time. Resistin is a very interesting hormone that's made by adipose tissues, and it is considered to be an insulin antagonist. Okay, so if a hormone is an antagonist to another, that means it counteracts that hormone. It has opposite effects of that hormone, or it reduces the activity of that hormone. So resistin is believed to decrease the activity of insulin. And in fact, if you look at this diagram over here, it's thought that overproduction of resistin by fat cells may be the thing that's really responsible for insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes. This may really be why skeletal muscle cells, the liver, and even the fat cells themselves stop taking up glucose from the bloodstream and the body fluids. They start ignoring the glucose. They no longer respond to insulin. It may be because of overproduction of resistin. Resistin may be telling those tissues to ignore insulin. That's one idea behind insulin resistance. That would also at least partially explain why type 2 diabetes is associated with excess weight gain and obesity, because if your adipose cells have lots of fat stored in them, that seems to increase their production of resistin. And in a way that might make sense. The fat cells may be telling your liver and skeletal muscles and even other fat cells, don't take in glucose and use that for energy, because we've got all this stored fat here. You don't need to, ignore the glucose, use the fat for energy. So that could be the idea behind that and why it works that way. Then, interestingly enough, the adipose tissues also produce another hormone called adiponectin, which does the other thing, has the other effect. It actually enhances sensitivity to insulin. So these hormones are not all that well understood yet, but there's a lot of interest in them because they do seem to be tied to insulin, and they could, if we could figure these hormones out, it might provide us with some new avenues for combating type 2 diabetes. All right, there are enteroendocrine cells. Entero, whenever you see that, that refers to the intestinal tract. Intestinal tract, and it is tract with a T and not track with a K. You do have some endocrine cells in the small intestine that produce some hormones, and we'll study those when we get to the digestive system. I just want you to be aware that there are some endocrine cells in the small intestine for now. Heart and kidneys also produce some hormones, believe it or not, that are involved in cardiovascular functions, and we're going to hear quite a bit more about those when we get to the cardiovascular system. But for now, I just want to introduce these to you. The heart produces a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. Not A and P like this class, but ANP. Natriuretic. Natri refers to sodium. Nater is the Latin word for sodium. That's where the chemical symbol Na for sodium came from. Uretic, like a diuretic, you pee something out. This hormone causes you to release more sodium in your urine. And what did we say about water? Water follows sodium. So if this hormone is telling your kidneys, leave more sodium in the urine, we need to pee out more sodium, water's going to follow that. So it's going to decrease your blood pressure and your blood volume. So it's doing the opposite. What hormone is that doing the opposite of? If we think about it, you think back, aldosterone. If you said aldosterone, you're right. Aldosterone has the opposite effect. So that one's involved in controlling blood pressure and blood volume as well. And we will be returning to that one later. The kidneys make a hormone called erythropoietin, and Erythro refers to, eryth means red, so in this case it's referring to red blood cells. This is a hormone that stimulates red blood cell production, which occurs in your bone marrow. We'll be learning more about that shortly in your urine unit 2. Renin is a hormone that is produced by the kidneys as well, that is involved in a step-by-step process that leads to aldosterone production. And yes, we could talk about that now, but I'm going to wait until we do blood pressure in Unit 3, because that's when we'll really be focused in on that topic. So we don't want to get too heavy and too deep into blood pressure for now. I just want you to have heard of these things at this point. Okay, in the skeletal system, the osteoblasts, if you remember those are your the cells in your skeletal system that synthesize your bone matrix. And those osteoblasts, they actually make a hormone that's been discovered called osteocalcin. And very interesting hormone. People are very interested in this one as well, because it seems to be involved in various things like telling the pancreas to secrete more insulin. It helps restrict fat storage, improves glucose handling, reduces your body fat. You can see that little laundry list of things listed there. So people are, some of those things sound very beneficial, so people are interested in the roles that this hormone may have. Also for type 2 diabetics, apparently in type 2 diabetics, some type 2 diabetics have low levels of osteocalcin. So could we give this to patients artificially as a drug to help control type 2 diabetes? Could be interesting. The skin produces a compound called cholecalciferol. All right, so you've heard before that the skin makes vitamin D, and cholecalciferol is like an immature form of vitamin D that's made in the skin, and then it goes to the liver and the kidneys to be converted into the active form of vitamin D. It has to undergo some changes. And that's really functioning like a hormone, because when it gets to the intestinal tract, after it's been converted into fully mature active vitamin D, it tells the cells that line your small intestine to absorb more calcium. That's why vitamin D is important for calcium uptake. In the thymus is also considered to be an endocrine gland because it produces some hormones called thymosins, and they're really not, remember how we said hormones get into the bloodstream and can act at long distances away from where they're made, and the thymosins are made in the thymus, but they really act in the thymus. And if you remember, when you have cells that are near each other and one is secreting substances that act on nearby cells, those are called paracrine substances when that happens, more so than hormones. They're involved in your T cells. Those are a type of white blood cell that are important for your immune system. Those thymosins stimulate those T cells to become mature. We'll hear a little bit more about that when we get to the immune system, and you'll hear a whole lot more about T cells when you take your microbiology class. Aging, what happens to us as we age? Your endocrine glands, the cells in your endocrine glands, as you age, they don't function as well as they used to, just like any other body part. So growth hormone levels decline with age. That makes sense. And since growth hormone, one of the things that it does is it stimulates synthesis of skeletal muscle tissue. That's one of the reasons why your muscles atrophy with age. Growth hormone also helps keep your body fat levels lower, and so that's another one of the reasons why you tend to put on more and more and more body fat as you get older also. TH, those thyroid hormone, that's abbreviation there for thyroid hormone. Those T3 and T4 thyroxins, those levels go down as you age. That makes sense. So your basal metabolic rate, your BMR, that's basically how many calories of energy do you burn through in a day. That's your BMR, and that's going to go down as you get older, which everybody knows that your metabolism slows down as you get older, and that's at least partially due to your thyroid hormone levels going down. PTH, parathyroid hormone, interestingly, those levels remain pretty constant with age, but PTH tells your osteoclasts in your bones to harvest calcium out of the bone matrix. Remember, those osteoclasts are kind of like Pac-Man cells that dissolve the bony matrix and release the calcium out of there and return it to your body fluids. So estrogen in women is supposed to dial down the osteoclasts so that they don't respond quite as strongly to PTH. And so in women after menopause, their ovaries aren't really producing estrogen anymore, and so those osteoclasts are no longer kept under control, and they respond really strongly to the PTH, and they just harvest more and more and more and more calcium out of the bones, and then that can lead to demineralizing effects, and if they get severe enough, that's when you develop osteoporosis. All right, so that is actually the end of the endocrine system physiology. Be sure you are doing all the review activities. Use your Mastering A&P homework questions to help you review. There's a lot to remember with the endocrine system, and I will have some other activities posted on Blackboard as well to help you and to help the whole class apply this information that you're learning to clinical scenarios and to make it a little bit more real-world applicable. So we'll be doing that, probably discussing some of those things on the discussion board. Thank you very much, and let me know if you have any questions.